Welcome to the With You and For You podcast. Our desire is to equip college-age students within the Edmond, OKC area by discussing topics and questions that are relevant to our generation. With that in mind, thank you for tuning in, and let's get to the show.
All right, what's up, everyone? Here we are, back with the podcast. I am leading us because I've changed up the entire topic for this episode in the last minute. And so Krista's mad at me. Riley doesn't really know what to do with me. Tyson's just here for a good time.
We had a plan. We knew exactly what we were doing.
I thought we were going to talk about prayer.
To be honest, I never know what we're doing. I just show up.
Yeah.
Kyle.
Usually how this, let me just explain it to you guys. This thing's kind of set up where Riley will send us some questions, maybe, an hour before, and we kind of sometimes look at them.
Most of the time not.
Yeah, most of the time we don't, but we still have those. I came in today a little late and just erased the whiteboard, and here we go. And so
Clean slate.
Yep, okay. Clean slate. I think it's important. So today what we're talking about is we're going to talk about finishing well. And here's why I say this. It was Thursday during worship. I was sitting there and I was like, man, we haven't really touched on it. And it's something for me, if I talk about finishing well, people start to feel like, oh, Kyle's coming at me because, he sees me not finishing well or he sees me not around or something like that. And so I wanted to change it up. And I just want to start off with a generic, open-ended question. What does it mean to you to finish well?
Okay. Do you want us all to answer?
Hey, you take it.
Are you, okay, you're the one asking questions this week.
I'll ask some questions. I might throw in my little 2 cents here.
Okay.
Every now and then.
So you want me to answer this question?
If you want to answer it.
If you want.
If you want me to.
You can't handle this, can you? You're not used to
this. This is so odd to me.
Riley
already started talking. You gotta finish it well since you've started.
Oh, that was bad.
You guys ever see the Dark Knight?
No, not once.
Not once? Not at all? Okay. Well, no. Yeah. All right.
So for me, finishing well, it's actually something that's been tough for me in the past. I know back at TCC, when this guy, we were back at TCC, Krista, we talked a lot about just how busy I was. And at that time I had 2 jobs. I was carrying a full load at school. And then I was also working at the BCM. And during that time, it just got worse and worse through the semester. My quiet times got worse. My rest got worse. And honestly, my relationship with the Lord got worse. Just because I was not doing the things I was supposed to do. And it just started piling up. All those things started piling up. And I didn't finish well at all. And to be completely honest, it hurt my relationship with the Lord during that time anyway. And obviously there's grace in that. Obviously there's mercy within that. And I know the Lord forgave me for that. But I'd never want to be in those shoes again. Because I felt the most empty I've felt in a long time. All those things that I was trying to do and was a part of were not fulfilling. They were not satisfying at all. And I was trying to find satisfaction in those things. In reality, that's not going to ever bring satisfaction. The only thing that could ever do that is the Lord. So I know that going into this semester, I had a mindset of okay, this is all I'm going to say yes to. I say yes up to this point, and that's it. Because if I push past that point, I'm going to get into this bad zone to where I try to find satisfaction in those things that I'm doing again. And honestly, how I finish well is by starting with knowing what I'm going into and knowing what I'm doing, and starting well. That's ultimately for me. That's how I finish well, is by starting well. So.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, I think when I think about finishing well, I think about, college students starting off a semester, you get especially if it's in August, you get the calendar and you write down all your classes. I don't know if this is everybody, but you color code them, you put the due dates. Tyson shaking his head no, but maybe this is just a girl thing. I don't know, but just like, I mean, doing all these things, and then it gets like, I mean, you have like the last like 9 weeks or like the last 5 weeks, and you're like, I don't even know where my calendar's at. Like, I don't even remember where I put my list of homework to do. And your motto is C's get degrees. Like, it's just, that was me. Like, I was very much like, I would start really well, and then towards the end of semester, I'd be like, I'm just over this. And there was just a lot of times where I think kind of what Riley was touching on, like, there are some things that you can balance out and be like, hey, like, this is definitely more of a priority than this thing. But I think just wanting to finish well is just understanding and realizing, like, hey, like, the start, the middle, and the end, everything I'm doing is all for the glory of the Lord. And if I'm going to do it all for the glory of the Lord, then I have to do it all well and to the best of my ability.
Yeah. I'm glad we all just like start talking this one. But man, I was not a good student.
Do you not have a calendar?
No. But also, I don't know. Like, sometimes finishing well for me meant dropping a class and swallowing my pride in that. But outside of school, I guess, I think like finishing well is just understanding that like we may have put in a lot of grunt work at the beginning of an assignment, of a task, of a responsibility, to make things easier throughout. But that doesn't mean that we just need to coast to the end after that. Like, finishing well means like, okay, like I'm not just going to come near the end of my time and then just be like, well, that's it. I only have 2 weeks left. I can't do anything better. Obviously, like, we're called to like do things in excellence. And so like finishing well to me is just like realizing that like, okay, even near the end, there are things that you can do to, whether that's a better your relationship with God, better relationship with others, or better your relationship with yourself. If that makes sense.
So 1 Corinthians chapter 9, starting verse 24, it says, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. So they do it to obtain a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore I run in such a way as not to run aimlessly. I box in such a way as to avoid hitting air. But I strictly discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified." When I think of this idea of finishing well, I don't just mean academically, obviously, or else this episode would be really short and be really kind of lame. And I don't think that people struggle with maybe the motivation to finish well academically. I think our culture is very geared towards, hey, yes, like I want to start the semester well so that, hey, my workload's a little easier as the semester comes to a close. Or I'm in a major that's just ridiculously overbearing regardless of what time of year it is. But I think of just like the trend of a school year, we tend to see people begin to stop showing up to things, and I'm not just talking about BCM. Like, like whether that's their young adult thing at their church or whatever it is, like those are the things that get cut first because academically they become busier. Maybe their workload, from their job takes on more. And so what are things that you recognize or you have seen, or even, Riley, as you mentioned at your time at TCC, like, hey, these are things that I needed to put in place so that I could maintain the community I had spiritually, or so I just prioritize those things because those things are easily cut out when I am overwhelmed with all the things I have to get done because a grade is coming, right? I think it's really easy for us to cut out the spiritual things because we're like, well, God will forgive us. Hey, it's not that big a deal. Hey, it's not going to matter. I am going to be graded on this assignment much sooner than I'm going to stand before the Lord, maybe, to where I'm going to choose the assignment over the spiritual thing. So what do you think are some things that you're like, hey, as I read what Paul's saying in 1 Corinthians. I don't want to run aimlessly. Like, what are things that help me not run aimlessly?
I think for me, but my mindset's different. I will always sacrifice other things for community. That's just the way I'm built, which it led to some poor grades along the way. I won't lie about that. But I think that's the understandable thing is like, okay, when it comes down to it, you have an assignment, you have community, you have sleep, right? And so like if you're sacrificing your community so you can get your assignment done and you can get to sleep, then that may not always be the best option for you. Because like a lot of the time when we come near the end of final season, we all start to isolate. And that's where I think the danger comes in, of this idea of loneliness and like battling through this stuff on our own. And so like sometimes it means that in order to like set a system in play, it's like, okay, like I know I need to get the assignment done. I know I need to not sacrifice the community for everything. So sadly, that might mean I lose a little sleep sometimes. But like that's just my mindset has always been geared towards that. And so like some people would say that's wrong, but
Yeah.
I think that community is very important when it comes to dealing with loneliness. And I think that during this final season time, we have this idea of like, okay, we all just got to put our head down and do our own separate thing. And that just leads to a lot of like a season of loneliness doesn't need to be there.
Yeah.
I know for me, I had to put in place a set of non-negotiables. So like for some things, like for example, in the morning, I get up and I fix some breakfast. I do my quiet time and then I work out every morning, just because that's a non-negotiable for me. And I know that like without that, like my day is going to be different. Without getting into the Word and getting intimate with the Lord and that time with Him, and then going and physically working out, like I know without that time, my day would look completely different, and how I treat people would look completely different. So I know for me, it starts out with that, and then another thing is, like James says, letting your yes be your yes and your no be your no. This is still something I'm working on. I'm trying to get better at, but I know that for a fact that when I'm applying that to my life, and when I'm letting my yes be my yes and my no be my no, and like tracking out with a calendar those things, that's truly how I finish well. I would say is by just making sure that I'm applying those things and living by those things, those non-negotiables, and letting my yes be my yes, my no be my no. So,
Yeah.
I think it just goes back to your priorities and just reordering those to where you're not, like you said, Kyle, running aimlessly, but you have like goals in mind. You have the goal of, hey, I want to continuously like deepen my relationship with the Lord by being plugged into community, by going to church on Sunday and things like that. And I think looking at your priorities, and we talk about this a lot, but just and like having that accountability and having somebody that is not going to give you the option to stay home on Sunday from church. And I think that, could even be like somebody that you know that's going to be texting you at like 9:00 whenever and being like, hey, like you're coming to church today, or like, do you need a ride to church? Like not giving you an out. So that, you're being held accountable to those things and being held accountable to the community that you have that is, committed to helping you grow in your relationship with the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. So I think when we look at kind of the idea of finishing well, and you think of, okay, hey, like in the grand scheme of things, there are sometimes we get the opportunity to see like when things are naturally coming to a close, right? Hey, I know college will end 4 years, maybe 5, 6, 7, depending. But it's like, I know that there will be an end date. And so some people, and I think this is a natural tendency, I think we can come into this and we do this to where it's like, hey, I experienced this, at NEO when I was there for 2 years. Like, I know I'm going to be transferring. And I'm kind of geared like Tyson. It's like, hey, I'll probably sacrifice the things to be able to like, I'm going to get these things done early so that I can get to bed and get quality sleep, to where I'm like, no, I'm going to be the one that's going to go to BCM on a Thursday night and be like, I still have a 10-page paper to write, and then stay up all night and write the 10-page paper that's due the next day. Like, that's just the way I'm geared. But as we think of this semester is getting ready to come to a close. We have, people getting ready to graduate. We have people that may be looking at not being in Edmond, next year, not being around the area, like, or if people are in those kind of times of their life where it's like, hey, this thing's coming to an end. So what they start to do is they start to cut things out to help them cope later, because they know I'm not going to be around these people anymore. So what would you say to those people that are kind of like, hey, I'm coming to this natural finish line, and I'm going to start taking the necessary steps to help myself be able to emotionally cope with losing these key people in my life by just not going around, not being involved, cutting these things out early? What would you say to them?
Quit it. I think that relationships naturally decay, but I don't ever want to take the word naturally out of that. Mm-hmm. And so like distance will separate some people, and it'll keep some people close, and that's just the natural order of like relationships and friendships. But this idea of like, well, I'm going to start taking steps back away from my friend group, that way whenever I do leave it'll be easier on me, is not true. It's going to be harder on you the whole time, just because that's not like the right way to treat a friend. And so like finishing well within that is just like, and I think the bottom line of why we do that, why we take those steps back without like talking to people, is we're afraid of having those conversations. And so I think in order to finish that well, like have the conversations with your friends. It's a very natural thing. I have some friends who were in my wedding who moved away and I haven't seen since my wedding. I have other friends who were there in my wedding who I meet with weekly still. But like at no point would I just like cut them out. I think we need to start having these conversations with these friends of saying like, hey, like I value our relationship. I understand it's going to be harder to hang out with you here in a couple weeks, couple months, couple years. But like, I just want you to know that like, I'm willing to hang out whenever or like whenever it's possible. And like just have those open and honest conversations instead of just like taking control into your hands and then deciding like, oh no, I'll start to withdraw from this relationship.
Yeah, I always think there is a lot of relationships, just viewing them even just from like an eternal and temporal perspective, and just knowing like, hey, like this person, I mean, we've had a great relationship. They helped me in my relationship with the Lord. And I mean, guarding those relationships. And I think like a big thing is, I mean, like my best friend back home in Tulsa, she came up here last week and we hung out and we planned that 2 months in advance. But that's just our schedules and things like that right now. But we see the impact that our relationship has on each other. And so we're like, hey, we're gonna guard that. But I think even in me leaving Tulsa and coming to Edmond, there's a lot of relationships that, I mean, I wanted to keep and to continue. And sometimes like I'll call those people. But I think a big thing that I kind of had to learn, that I think students that are discipling other students have to learn, is if they're moving away, not to just leave the people that they're discipling like in the dust. But and I think this helps in finishing well in the sense of like, hey, like I'm discipling this girl. I knew I was moving from Tulsa to Edmond, and I wasn't just gonna be like, okay, well I'm leaving, so good luck finding somebody else. Like
Deuces.
Yeah, like I mean, helping continue and investing in their relationship with the Lord without even being there can be you simply being like, hey, I want to help my time with you be well spent and finished well by like passing you off onto somebody else that I trust that can also invest in you. And I think we drop the ball a lot in discipleship when we leave, but I think it's important to also remember like you can have multiple people disciple you. And I think that's just important in helping finish well in the area that you're in and leaving in that way. And I know that really wasn't the question, but I just felt like that needed to be said in the sense of just discipleship and helping those and still investing in those even as you are leaving and moving on.
So it's dangerous. It's dangerous to isolate yourself and to start doing these things and to get away from community just because you're leaving. It says in 1 Peter 5:8-9, it says, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by the brotherhood throughout the world. And the way like lions hunt is they find somebody that is they find
They might.
well
Sometimes.
they find an animal that is isolated by themselves and away from the pack and the flock, and they go and they take it. And the devil is the same way. And whenever you are isolated and whenever you're by yourself, away from your flock, away from your community, even though you're about to leave that community, you have to stay with it because the devil will attack you and he will tempt you. He will be there. And I can guarantee that because I've been there. I did that a little bit towards the end of my time at TCC. And I regret it. I felt it and I went back to them. I went back to the guys that were keeping me accountable. I went back to them because I knew that like I needed accountability still, and I couldn't go without it. So I encourage you guys just to not isolate yourself, because if you're graduating, moving off, if you're going somewhere else, or you're just moving schools, something like that, stay with the community that you have right now, because it's isolating yourself is dangerous and it will only lead to sin.
Yeah, I think there's, obviously two sides of the spectrum when it comes to community, right? You can make your community an idol, or you can start to like distance yourself from your community because you just want to protect yourself and you don't like when relationships end or come to a close or whatever, and you just allow I think you open the door and allow the enemy to kind of start to tell you like, oh, well, they're not going to care about you anymore because you're not going to be around. They're going to text you or call you, which, Tyson, you bring up a good point. Like, relationships naturally, I don't know if I would say like, I think they can end, but it's also like they just change to where, if you're not around that person as much, like you're not obviously going to call them maybe every day. Like as you get married, you're not going to necessarily have deep conversations with them for 4 hours a day, because hopefully you have those conversations with your spouse, unless that person is your spouse. And then, hey, there it goes. But we see kind of this idea of a finish well, and I was thinking about this. Like you think of running a race, right? And some of it, like if you think of running, it's kind of like, hey, you think of that kick at the end, right? Usually you see people that have a really strong kick. Normally they do start well, and they kind of keep their pace, right? If they're trained quality runners. Sometimes like we're just lazy in the beginning to where that we have a good kick at the end because it's like, oh, I have all this energy that I didn't use.
Sandbagger.
Yeah, and I think there are parts of those, like as we run this race, and as Paul's mentioning, like running this race, everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. So self-control is a big part of it. So why do you think, and what does he mean, like when he's talking about like everyone who runs the race exercises self-control in all things? Why is self-control important?
That's a good question.
Are you going to say something?
That's a good question.
Well,
you got it.
Okay.
You got it, yeah.
Well, I think
gotta think.
it can be because little things can add up. And so what I mean by that is I think like not finishing well, you can compromise like going to church or going to BCM or your young adult group or whatever. Because you're like, oh, I have a lot of homework. But then it's like, why do you have a lot of homework? And it's like, because I had like 10 minutes to kill and I got on Instagram and then I looked back and it was a whole hour. Because you weren't exercising self-control, and these little things are building up to where now you're stuck at this point of, hey, I was lazy in this and I can either go to my community or I can do this homework that I know that I have a grade for. And I'm going to do that because I wasted my time here. And I think we need to exercise self-control because we can waste a lot of time and that can cause us to not finish well.
I think that the analogy at play that you use, kind of like this this lazy runner who didn't put forth the appropriate amount of energy. He didn't have self-control in that sense. And then so at the end he tries to make up for it, but normally it's too late, right? And then there's the opposite where someone just sprints out the gate and just wastes all their energy and didn't use self-control in that way, and now they can't even finish the race because they're just tired.
Like the little kids that run the 5K at Falls
Yeah.
Creek.
Yeah. And so I think that like self-control is important throughout the whole race because the analogy is it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, right? And so like understanding that like denying ourselves daily takes self-control, and it's going to take a lifetime of running the race to do that. And so like it's important to have self-control in a race because otherwise you're not going to be able to finish it well. If you're really tired, you're not going to be able to finish the race at all. And if you were just really lazy, you're going to look back and be like, oh, well, I sprinted to the end, but like, why didn't I sprint more? And so I think it's just important in that sense of like, okay, like if we're going to run a race well, then we have to modify our lives around the environment of that race.
Yeah. Self-control, like it's very important. It's something we have to choose every single day. Because Kyle, I know we've talked about on this podcast before how we've seen even like pastors and people of like high authority not finish well, and they've run this like awesome race that like people look up to, and they look at them as role models, and all of a sudden they have affairs and they go off and do these terrible things. Like what happened? Like I thought they were good. And I thought they were in good standing with the Lord. But I know with that, here, let me rephrase that. With those things, they weren't practicing self-control every day. Because like you've said before, they don't just choose to do that, just spur of the moment one day. It's a long-standing thing of going through something every single day and not choosing self-control. And not choosing to have a heart of discernment, just to give things up to the Lord. And I know, like, it's a tough thing to do, and it's hard to give up things, and it's hard to give up things that you like a lot of the times. But if we truly want to finish well, we have to live with a mindset of self-control and learning to regulate the things we intake and the things we do. Because if we don't, they're going to take hold of us, and we're not going to finish well.
And that regulation is good things as well as bad things, right? Like you watch like these Olympic marathon runners, they run their race. You hear the announcers are talking about like, and the coaches will be sitting there saying like, hey, run your race. Like don't run the person next to you's race. Like that's completely different. Like you need to stay in your pace, how you're feeling. How your body's like, what your body's telling you, or else you will either exhaust yourself or you'll be so far behind, there's no way of catching up. And obviously, we don't run for perishable wreaths, as Paul mentions. Like, we run for an imperishable one. So we're running for Christ. And I think a big part of this self-control, because I talk to students all the time, and they'll tell me how busy they are and say, man, I just really need to cut something out. And Kyle, I just, I know I committed to do this, thing or to do that, but I don't have time. Like, I really just need to cut it out. And it's something to where it's like, obviously I'm not going to like chastise them and be like, how dare you, you dirty, rotten sinner. I'm not going to sit there and do those things unless, it's somebody I know really well.
You've
like
been
Riley.
hounded on me about not climbing. Whatever, man.
It's just because I want to hang out with you.
Oh, okay.
But it's one of those to where it's like, I'll tell students like, hey, you know what? If you don't want to serve on leadership with BCM, like that's great. That's fine. Just use this. Maybe you just come on Thursdays and you use it as a time for your time of worship and community with your peers. And that's what you do. And sometimes it happens, and then sometimes, they just kind of like stop showing up and stuff. And it's like, okay, because they're so busy with everything else. Hey, I'm leading 3 Bible studies at my church, and I'm doing this thing, and I'm doing this, and I'm working with the youth, and I'm doing all this stuff. And it's like every night's taken up with stuff that happens at my church, and then BCM, and then I have homework on top of that. And I'm like, you've literally filled your schedule to where you don't even have the chance to say no. So you're not even running with self-control because you've filled it with all of these things that are good things. That if you don't regulate that, you won't finish well. Like, yeah, you'll be able to look back and say, hey, like, by the grace of God, I made it through that. Or you'll look back and say, man, I'm burnt out and I don't want to work in the church, or I don't want to do ministry, or I don't want to serve in, this capacity. And I think it's heartbreaking, right? To see these things and to see it like, and that's where I just want to check myself, like as ministers, what are we asking people to commit to? To where it's like, hey, part of the self-control is being like, you know what? I can come to BCM on Thursday night, or I can go to this young adult worship, and my role here is to praise God for what he's doing in my life, to spend time with the Lord. I can have, that doesn't mean you just ignore everyone, don't have any conversations, right? But it's like, but I don't have to like have this expectation of leadership that I need to initiate all of these conversations with all these people. Like maybe I'm just coming here because I'm tired and I'm worn out and I'm exhausted. But having the self-control to not go beyond what you're like, kind of feeling comfortable, like, hey, if I need just a time of worship, or I just need to be on my knees before the Lord, like spend time with him, having the self-control to stay in that and not, oh, well, I'm gonna run a little faster. Or hey, I'm gonna push myself. Or hey, I'm gonna relax more than I need to. So I think really, as you mentioned, Riley, that's a good word, like regulating that and what that looks like in our life, and I think will really help us. And so Paul mentions kind of at the end, I strictly discipline my body and make it my slave so that after I've preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. So again, as I mentioned, just alluded to right there, doing the spiritual things, doing the ministry, going on mission, all great things. But Paul shows us that we need to discipline our bodies so that after we do those things, we don't disqualify ourselves. So what are ways that you regulate the spiritual services, the mission trip, sharing the gospel, having a day to where you're like, man, spiritually, this was a great day. But then you've exhausted yourself to where that next day you just disqualified yourself. Or, you talk about people in ministry. Hey, you're tired, you're frustrated at the smallest thing. You start looking at things you shouldn't be online. You start maybe flirting with people you shouldn't be flirting with, or those types of things. Watching things you shouldn't be watching, whatever that looks like. So how do you spiritually regulate after maybe hey, spiritually, this was a great day? Like, what do you think are some ways to regulate that?
I think first understanding that you're not the guy. Like you're not the I said that weird.
You're not him.
That like okay, like no matter how awesome of a day you had the day before, like you can't reproduce that day. You can't make that day happen again. Like anything that is of the Lord is from the Lord. And so understand that first of like, okay, like, because if you go out after that awesome spiritual day and then try to or make it happen again on your own, then you're just going to be left frustrated. You're just going to be left tired. You're just going to be left like empty. And so like with that, like that regulation of like, okay, like realizing it's not about me, it's about the Lord. And so like today the Lord has blessed me by bringing me along in this experience with him. And tomorrow the Lord may have called me to rest from that. And like understanding that, okay, like not every day is going to be an awesome day. I'm not always going to be perfect. Nothing's always going to go my way. And like just be a realist when it comes to like the life we live.
Yeah.
I think that helps like a foundational level. And then when it comes to frustrations and stuff like that, like don't internalize them and isolate. Well, I think that's the big topic is isolation. Like find people, and I'll say this very carefully. Find people outside of the situation to communicate with your frustrations and ask for advice.
Yeah.
Just because I feel like sometimes we complain to people inside the situation, and then that's just complaining, and there's no help. So like when you're frustrated with the Lord, when you're frustrated with your job, when you're frustrated with these things, like find people outside those situations to speak life into you, and don't just bottle them up, and just push through, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So something that I've found within my life is I need a Paul, a Barnabas, and a Timothy, and I'll kind of explain that a little bit. So as a Paul, I need somebody like pouring into my life consistently, and as I need that person there weekly to just be there for me and to answer questions and to honestly just disciple me. And then for Barnabas, I need accountability partners. I need friends that are there for me and are there to love on me and to raise me up spiritually. And then as you were talking about, Kyle, about like not being burnt out, those two things are necessities in your life. We need to have those as Christians, especially as Christians that are doing a lot of stuff and have a lot on their plate, who are maybe even working in ministry. I know that we need those things, and you, as you said, like you are pouring out. There comes a Timothy. The Timothy is a person that you're pouring out to, that you're building up, and you're there raising them as a disciple of Christ, and you're walking them through the Word, or they're coming to you and asking you questions. And I've taken that mindset and that structure and placed it into my life, and I know that that's like a priceless thing that I've put into it, because I'm happy to say that like I have two Pauls right here, Kyle and Tyson, that like pour into my life consistently. And I know that like without you guys, I wouldn't be okay, because I know that I would be a dry well, and I wouldn't be able to sit here and be talking about these things right now, because I would be exhausted and not have any light within me. So yeah, thank you guys. Yeah.
I agree.
Ah, nice. Amen. Amen. Yeah. So I guess just as we kind of come to a close, I mean, what's something that, if there's somebody that was kind of wrestling with that, like finishing well, kind of on the fence of cutting themselves out, just kind of isolating, or not isolating, but just like distancing themselves because, hey, the semester's coming to a close, or my time at this place is coming to a close. What would you tell them?
So I'm going to say a word. Don't laugh at me, okay? So when I isolate myself, or like segregated myself from community, whether it was good or bad community, was some of the like most depressive times in my life. But the things that helped me was the Word and memorizing the Word and getting into the Word. Because I think that will really help us pull ourselves out of isolation, or if we have kind of like started taking those step backs and we feel lonely, like the Word can pull us out of that. And so just starting there, like, okay, like I don't know where to go. Well, then go to the Word and start there. Just find a place and start reading. It's a pretty cool book. I don't know if y'all read it, but yeah, there's been some times I'm reading the Bible and I'm like, what the heck? This is dope.
What a mood.
So, like, yeah, just start there. Like, if you're really struggling with this idea of finishing well and, like, you've started to isolate yourself from your friends. Like, start by reading the Word. Also, maybe you need to apologize to some people. Maybe you need to kind of like buck up your pride and like make the decision. Like, okay, I've made a mistake. Cool. Let's correct it and move forward. But I think ultimately, like in finishing well, like don't ever think that you're done before you're done. And so don't ever think that just because you're 2 weeks away from finals and you've turned in all your big assignments that you're done. Don't ever think that, oh, well, I can get a C in this class if I don't even try anymore, that you're done. Don't think just because that you're engaged that you're done running the race. Like, you're not done until you're done.
That's right.
So don't forget that.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
I think, and a big thing that, like, I talk to girls a lot about is just remembering your why behind the things that you're doing. And so I think that can help a lot, like, in the sense of, okay, school, like, yes, why do you want to do this? And you're like, okay, because I want to, finish well in, like, my school and my studies. And it's like, okay, well, why do you want to go to BC? Why do you want to go to church? And just remembering those things of, like, hey, I'm doing these things because of the reason that I know that they're going to pour into me and into my relationship with Christ. And then kind of weighing out, okay, what am I going to guard? And what am I going to hold close to me? And what am I going to have people hold me accountable on? And just finishing well on those things. But I've just found, just over the years, reminding yourself of, hey, what's the why behind the things that I'm doing? And then allowing that to motivate you and allowing that to push forward everything that you do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to finish well, I believe we have to rest well. And I know we've talked about rest before on the podcast and everything, but it's a necessity. Like we need to rest. As human beings, we're flawed. We're not perfect, and we need to have times to where we're not doing anything. We get exhausted. We aren't able to go forever. And I know that resting well and finding like just maybe it's just a couple hours, because you might be saying right now, like, I don't have time to rest, guys. Like, I can't find any time. I don't think I can. You need to, and it's something that you need to find and to learn how to do. Whether it's just a couple hours, finding a day and just setting a portion of time aside to get in your word, to take a nap, to go on a walk, to just spend time with the Lord, either in prayer, just meditation, or just sitting in silence. Find a time to rest and just get right with the Lord.
Yeah.
Because we need it.
Yeah. Yeah. As you read the word, as you dive in, you read about these faithful followers of Christ that didn't know when their time was going to come to a close. And a lot of times we take that for granted. We think, hey, I'm going to live to be 80, 90. I'll be told, hey, you have this, like your time's going to come to an end in this amount of time, but we're not guaranteed that. And I just want to encourage everyone, like, you want to finish every part of your life well. Like, you want to finish your time in college well. You want to finish your singleness well. You want to go into marriage like having finished, singleness well and all those things. And you just want to be able to stand before the Lord one day and he says, well done, my good and faithful servant. And that starts today. Paul tells us to strictly discipline our bodies. He strictly disciplined his body so that he would not be disqualified. And so you're not going to feel like it. Every day you're not going to wake up and be like, yes, I'm so excited. I get to do these things. Like, no, it's a process. Discipline isn't easy. And so I thank you guys for allowing me to kind of hijack this episode and take over and discuss something that, the Lord has been laying on my heart. And I thank you guys for tuning in. We'll catch you next week.
Thanks for hanging out with us. Be sure to tune in next week where we'll be having another awesome discussion. And if you want more information or want to ask us a question, make sure to follow us on Instagram at UCO BCM.